In this lesson, we're looking at our standard of describing in depth characters, setting, or events in a story or dramas, drawing on those specific details from the text, that is, the character's thoughts, words, or actions. So this is where character, setting, and plot become important. Now, we've learned a little bit about plot and the basic elements in a plot, that being the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. We know that our plot is made up of events, and then it's those sequence of events putting that story into order. We know that our fiction texts typically have some type of problem and then a solution. That is, that what needs to be fixed. It's also known as the conflict. Now it's time for us to look a little bit more closely at conflicts, which is a struggle between either opposing forces or character. And these things can happen internally within a character or externally. There are 4 different types of conflicts, and then these are some mini examples. If we think about the text Turtle in Paradise, there are examples of each different type of conflict in there. For example, that man versus man conflict. We can examine Turtle and Bean and their relationship. A man versus self conflict, as we examine Turtle and her feelings about herself. We can look at man versus nature. That scene where the kids survive a hurricane is a good example of this type of conflict. And then finally, an overall man versus society conflict, as the Turtle and the other children are struggling against the hardships of the Great Depression. I'd like to take a moment to point out a specific type of text structure that allows us to examine characters in a little bit of a different way. Drama, also known as plays, is a writing form where dialogue shares the message, and it's meant to be performed in front of an audience. Scenes in a drama are where the setting then is the same, or perhaps where an action or an event occurs during a play and story. And this is how they're distinguished. Stage directions then are instructions to actors and directors that are written into the script. Now, anytime we look at a script, the structure is containing these elements that are different from a more narrative structure. We typically have a list of characters and some background information upon a setting. The play, script, or drama is written where directions or information for the actors to know often are distinguished in italics. These can be the stage directions. They can be bits of information for set design and scenery. Then we know that a character speaks because they're always identified with their name. So this is one way that we can experience dialogue. When a story is adapted into a movie, a play, script, or screenplay needs to be written from the text. So, looking at a dialogue in a play is a great way to examine characters. Sometimes we have a feature called a monologue. Monologues can be fun because a monologue is where we get basically a speech that's given by one character, and it gives the audience insight to this particular character's thoughts or feelings. Here's a monologue that can be performed. You can see that it's titled Steve. That's the big excuse. Here are the stage directions, and then this is just the dialogue, or excuse me, the monologue. These are other ways that we can also tell the interactions of characters. When we examine characters, we use evidence about what characters say, what they think or feel, and what they do to help us uncover their traits. Traits are basically adjectives that can describe a character. Now, one of my favorite book series is the 39 Clues. There are 10 books in the first part of this series, and in each of the books, the characters are described with their actions and their feelings and thoughts, and throughout the series, you really get to know them all. One of the main characters is Dan Cahill, and I find that little nuggets of information really help me build his personality. This is from the 5th book in this series, where this piece right here, "Can I drive now?" Dan asked again. "Not a chance. Come on, let me drive, please." Within the space of 30 seconds, Dan asked if he could drive 9 more times. Just this piece of dialogue and information about Dan leads me to determine that he is a very persistent individual. One of the things I did do was take a look at how Dan is introduced in the initial book in this series. In Chapter 2, there's a lot of information about Dan. Look at the opening sentence. He thought he had the most annoying big sister on the planet. That was before she set fire to $2 million. He loved collecting things. And so I can go on just pulling out details in the text to really analyze Dan, not only from his physical qualities, but also get an idea of the character traits he possesses. Here is a lesson that I did analyzing Dan Cahill.
One of our goals as readers is to be sure that we can describe in depth a character in a story, drawing on specific details from the text. In particular, we want to make sure that we can closely look at a character's thoughts, words, and actions. And so I'm going to do that now using a text selection. So I'm looking at a small part of the 39 Clues, Book 1, The Maze of Bones. And I want to focus on the character of Dan Cahill. I'd like to get some information about Dan so that I can analyze him and write a response. As I read about Dan, I learn that he feels he has the most annoying big sister on the planet. I read on and I find out that he felt he had a cool grandmother. And so he hopes to make a rubbing of her tombstone, which seems kind of interesting to me. Dan loves collecting things. He collected baseball cards, autographs, famous outlaws, Civil War weapons, rare coins, and every cast he had since kindergarten. All 12 of them? You know, that says to me that he's probably a pretty active boy, and I'll bet he's been in a lot of accidents. Collecting casts kind of seems like an odd thing to me. So on this page, I see that Dan wonders if she gave the other drivers nightmares about clowns. I was picturing a clown from that description, so it seems to me like Dan feels that his aunt looks like a clown. So read on, Amy's in here. She has long reddish-brown hair, unlike Dan's, which was dark blonde. So Dan has dark blonde hair. Oh, but they both have the same eyes, green like jade. Now I notice that Amy was 3 years older than Dan, and she was 14. So I definitely can use this information to figure out that Dan is an 11-year-old boy. As I continue to read about Dan, I notice that he wanted to go to the funeral in his ninja clothes, And he felt comfortable and deadly when he pretended to be a ninja. So I think ninjas are pretty important to him. Now they're talking about their au pair, which is like a nanny or babysitter. Dan seems to like this au pair. He says she's nice. Of course, his great aunt says that she almost let him burn down the neighbor's apartment building, and Dan said exactly. So to me, he seems like he's pretty active and does things that probably get him in trouble often, especially since he thinks Nellie's nice because she seems to let him get away with these things. Further reading about Dan tells us that she likes Nellie, or he likes Nellie, because she makes amazing waffles. She usually cranked her iPod up to brain damage level. She didn't hear when his bottle rocket collection went off. Tells me that Dan must really think a lot about Nellie. As I read on, I notice that his sister calls him a name, and he comments that you can't call a ninja lord that. So this further supports my thinking that he's pretty much into being a ninja. It sounds like ninjas are kind of a hobby for him. A little more about Dan as they're driving along. I thought it was interesting that he had promised himself he wouldn't get sappy, but he began to feel sad. This really tells me how he felt about his grandmother, Grace. She had been one of the only people who'd ever cared about them. Now I have lots of information about Dan, so I'll go ahead and stop here and think about what I want to say about Dan. So before I write, I start with a really quick plan. Here I've outlined 3 paragraphs that I can write about Dan. I've got my main ideas, at least 3 details, and then I know I need to give myself a wrap-up sentence. Using this plan, I can write 3 paragraphs about what I learned from Dan just by analyzing the text, looking closely at the details. So I started writing about how I'm analyzing Dan Cahill. It was important that I mentioned the book title, that I wrote it with capital letters, and that I underlined it. I also made sure that I mentioned that Dan was the protagonist in this. Now, I moved on to make sure that I used the information from the text in my general description, because this is my first paragraph. I was able to figure out that he was an 11-year-old boy with dark blonde hair and jade green eyes. I inferred that he must be accident prone because the evidence in the text was that he had collected all 12 of his casts he had had since kindergarten. Now, it was important that I quoted from the text. When I use those quotation marks, I am citing evidence from the text, and that supports my thinking. As I finished up this paragraph, I made sure that I ended with my own wrap-up sentence. My next paragraph was about the interesting hobbies that Dan had. I noted that he collected all kinds of things, including those odd tombstone rubbings. I made sure that I included information about how he felt about ninjas, and I supported that with saying that he felt comfortable and deadly, being sure I was quoting from the text, and I even added that he called himself a ninja lord. I was able to use things like his bottle rocket collection, and I inferred that it tended to get him in trouble, like when his aunt said that he burnt down his neighbor's apartment building. Again, I wrapped this up by saying the hubbies must keep him busy. As I moved into my last paragraph about Dan, I used his information about what he had commented on and the people in his life. I started with his sister, as he said he felt that she was the most annoying big sister on the planet, making sure that I was citing that evidence from the text and that I incorporated it into my thinking. When you cite evidence from a text, you don't want to just write what the text said. You want to be sure you explain it. Just like I did here with Aunt Beatrice. She must look strange since, and then I quoted, Dan wondered if she gave the other drivers nightmares about clowns. Now, as Dan thought about Nellie, who was his au pair, he said she was nice and she made amazing waffles, and that she would be missed when she got fired. All of these things about Dan led me to wrap this up saying that he has strong feelings about the people in his life. So I was able to take evidence from the text and explain it to write 3 paragraphs about the character Dan Cahill.
I'm giving you the definitions of the different signposts as we notice and note things going on in a story, and these typically pertain to characters and their analysis. I also have some definitions for foreshadowing, suspense, symbolism, a flashback, what an oxymoron is, irony, different types of irony with situational irony, a paradox, cosmic irony and dramatic irony, and then also tone and mood. This information is for you to include so that we can reference it as we examine different texts.